but you did ask about Gilgamesh itself, and so we probably do need to at least give an overview of it. Gilgamesh, like I said, is this probably semi-historical king. In other words, there probably is a kernel of truth to a Gilgamesh. He's the king of Uruk, who for whatever reason takes on this romantic mythical flavor later on with later kings, and then and by the way, he continues on. We have fragments of the Gilgamesh story. They've always been known. In fact, we have it all the way down to Berosus, the Babylonian priest who's writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC. His name is actually mentioned in Qumran.
Yes, I remember reading that.
Where he's described as a giant, by the way, interestingly enough. And even in classical sources, his name is found. And so it's very widespread. And as far as Megiddo in northern Canaan, we have a fragment of the Gilgamesh epic. And so it's far and wide, and there's fragments of it from the old Babylonian period all the way down to Neo-Assyrian, and like I said, then later. Gilgamesh is a great hero. In fact, in many respects, very early, by the beginning of the 20th century, scholars, German and otherwise, recognized, because of their classical heritage, that Gilgamesh and Achilles seem to share some things in common. They start off as spoiled brats who are abusing, for example, Gilgamesh, who's the king of Uruk, he's clearly abusing the males in his city by forced labor on them. He's abusing the females by having sexual relations, and abusing them. And so he's a king that's not a good shepherd. And anybody reading it in Mesopotamia recognizes that he's not very nice. And so the people cry up to heaven about this unworthy king, and whatever group of people put this together or wove it together, because, by the way, there's no one single author. There's somebody who calls himself a weaver who's woven together different strands of tradition and created a new, something new, I suppose. But by taking about half of the dozen traditions there, for example, the rival to Gilgamesh, who's now going to sort of check him, is called Enkidu. Well, he's actually well known in some of the other traditions. He's one of his faithful sidekicks who's always a servant, but here he's an equal rival who fights him, to a draw, we suppose, at some point. But then, and of course, the gods are checked at this point because Gilgamesh and Enkidu become best buddies rather than mortal enemies. And now they go off on adventures, and their goal is to create an immortal name for themselves. So they kill beasts, etc. The goddess Ishtar, and of course the gods and goddesses of Mesopotamia act a lot like the gods of Greece. They're like us in every way, but except they're on steroids. And so they're stronger than us, but they're also more evil than we are. And so you just expand when they get jealous, they're 100 times more jealous than we are. And so they're very, very dangerous.
Right.
It's kind of like, I suppose, evil superheroes in our movies.
Right. Okay.
And so Ishtar proposes to Gilgamesh for ephemeral sexual relations. He rejects her proposal, and because he says, I actually like my friendship with Enkidu more, and it's not homoerotic at all. It just means that I'm more interested in having a deep relationship than to have a ephemeral relationship. And by the way, you have a bad sexual history, Ishtar. I'm not interested. And the irony about this is that she's the city goddess. In other words, she's the goddess of the city of Uruk. And so there's all sorts of things going on here. I think there's a subtle way that the writers are dissing the god. Some of the gods of Mesopotamia were like, they're really acting this way. Can you believe that Ishtar is acting this way? It's not very nice. And so Ishtar's furious that he rejects him. She asks her father, On, the I suppose he would be CEO emeritus of the universe. Daddy, he dissed me, do something about it. They send down the bull of heaven, and of course, Gilgamesh and Enkidu destroy the bull of heaven. The gods determine, this can't happen anymore. Let's draw straws and see which one of those two heroes has to die. Of course, it's Enkidu, because otherwise the story would be over. Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh is heartbroken. When he finds out that Enkidu dies, he decides to go on a quest for eternal life. In other words, I want to see him again. My friend is dead. Oh my goodness, I'm terrified about his friend. But what about me? I guess that's going to happen to me too. It might be slower. And so he goes on this eternal quest. And of course, in Mesopotamia, everyone knows that you're going to die. There's no such thing as immortality, but there is name immortality, by the way. And so he goes on to his quest. He meets an alewife as he's going on his quest. And he says, just go home and have a family. In other words, make the best of your life. Go home and enjoy, family and children. And of course, he's not ready for that. And so he continues on. He finally ends up meeting Utnapishtim, who's the Babylonian Noah, at least particular story. And so now we have the flood story, which talks about the fact that, I got immortal life, but not everybody else did. You're not going to get it. Oh, by the way, I'll give you a little bonus. If you swim in the river and get to the bottom of the river, you'll find the plant of life. And it would at least give you temporary respite. In other words, you'll live longer. He gets it, but instead of being selfish and eating the plant right then and there, he lays it on the side as he's getting dressed, and a stupid snake, of course, steals it.
Okay.
But the point of it is that he's learning about character. He was planning on taking it home and giving it to his city and people, rather than simply partaking of it of himself. And so you're beginning to realize that this he's learned some of his lessons. He might end up being a good king. Well, he comes home and he begins to realize that, to be a good king, you have to be selfless. And then he starts looking at the walls. Oh, I did achieve immortality. Look at the walls I've built and all these things. And then, of course, he doesn't die in this story, although we do have one tradition of a Gilgamesh who dies. But the point is, in other words, it's actually a positive story from the standpoint is if you do good deeds and you have great character, your name will live on.